The awakening of sound. 8 billion years ago, when Earth was still young and turbulent, when boiling oceans covered forming continents and the sky glowed in shades of orange and red due to volcanic gases, something extraordinary was happening. Not on the chaotic surface of the planet, but in the silent depths of the primordial ocean, where pressure was crushing and darkness absolute. This is the story of Ishkara, not a creature in the sense we know, but something different, something unique. A form of life that evolved not through traditional chemistry, but through patterns, vibrations, and resonances. An entity that learned to weave reality through silence and sound, transforming the deep ocean into its canvas and pressure waves into its tools. To understand Ishkara, we must temporarily forget everything we know about life. We must imagine a type of existence so fundamentally different from ours that we can barely recognize it as life. And we must go back to a time when Earth was learning the rules of biology, when life was experimenting with forms that would never exist again. Chapter 1. The Primordial Earth. Imagine a world you wouldn't recognize. Earth 3.8 billion years ago was an alien planet, so different from our modern home that a time traveler would feel like they had visited another world. The sun was about 30% dimmer than today, but that didn't make Earth cooler. On the contrary, the planet teemed with heat. The atmosphere was a toxic mix of methane, ammonia, carbon dioxide, and water vapor. There was no free oxygen, the gas we breathe so naturally. The sky wasn't blue, but tinged with orange and reddish hues due to aerosols and volcanic gases filling the air. Lightning tore through the clouds constantly, electrical discharges so intense they lit the sky like perpetual day. Volcanoes dotted the young Earth's surface. They weren't like the volcanoes we know today, rare and isolated. They were countless, scattered everywhere, spewing lava and gases continuously. Earth's crust was thin and fragile, still solidifying after the planet's violent formation. Tectonic plates moved rapidly, colliding and separating in a chaotic geological ballet. But it was in the ocean that things became truly interesting. The primordial ocean covered nearly the entire surface of the planet, interrupted only by a few emerging volcanic islands. This water was hot, much hotter than modern oceans, reaching 70 or 80 degrees Celsius in many places. It was also extremely salty and acidic, full of dissolved minerals that made it seem more like a chemical soup than water. Chapter 2. The Resonant Depths. In the deepest regions of this primitive ocean, kilometers below the turbulent surface, existed a unique environment. Here, pressure was immense, hundreds of times greater than modern sea-level atmospheric pressure. Temperature fluctuated between extremes, with hydrothermal vents spewing water at 400 degrees Celsius, while surrounding areas remained merely lukewarm. But what made these depths truly special was sound. The primordial ocean was extraordinarily noisy. Submarine volcanic eruptions created deafening rumbles. Rocks cracking under tectonic stress generated shock waves. Hydrothermal vents hissed and roared as superheated water gushed from the crust. Even the movement of water, disturbed by currents and temperature differences, created constant hums. These sound waves traveled through the ocean, reflecting off rocky surfaces, interfering with each other, creating complex resonance patterns. In certain places, where the ocean floor's geometry was suitable, these waves formed standing patterns, vibrations that persisted indefinitely, constantly renewing themselves. It was in these resonance points, in these natural acoustic chambers formed by peculiar rock formations, that something remarkable began to happen. The sound waves weren't just random disturbances. They carried energy, and energy can do interesting things when properly concentrated. Chapter 3. Sonic Chemistry. Most of us think of chemistry as something visual, molecules meeting and reacting. But chemistry can also be directed by sound. Sound waves intense enough can break molecules, force them to bond in new ways, and even organize particles into regular patterns. In the acoustic chambers of the deep ocean, this sonic chemistry was operating on a massive scale. Pressure waves compressed and expanded the water thousands of times per second. These oscillations created temporary hotspots, where temperature spiked dramatically for fractions of a second before cooling again. In these pulses of heat, simple organic molecules present in the ocean reacted in ways they couldn't under normal conditions. Amino acids linked into short chains, lipids organized into membrane-like structures, nucleotides, the building blocks of RNA and DNA, formed and accumulated. But what made these reactions truly unique was their spatial organization. The sound waves weren't random. They formed patterns, nodes, and antinodes, places where intensity was maximum or minimum. Molecules were pushed to these nodes by the force of the waves, concentrating into specific three-dimensional arrangements. Imagine a hologram made not of light, but of sound. Imagine molecules being organized in space not by their inherent chemical properties, but by the pressure waves surrounding them. It was in this sonic matrix, in this sculpture of vibrations, that Ishkara would be born. Chapter 4. The First Pattern. There was no specific moment when Ishkara began to exist. There was no first cell, no first self-replicating molecule, no clear point of origin. Instead, Ishkara emerged gradually from the acoustic patterns of the deep ocean, an emergent property of sufficient complexity. It began as a particularly stable interference pattern. Two nearby hydrothermal vents, pulsing at slightly different frequencies, created a beat pattern, an amplitude modulation that oscillated slowly. This pattern organized molecules in space, creating structures that, by chance, had the property of reinforcing the very acoustic pattern that created them. It was a feedback loop. The sound pattern organized molecules. The organized molecules reflected and refracted sound waves in specific ways, subtly altering the acoustic pattern. If that alteration reinforced the original pattern, it became stronger, more stable. If it weakened the pattern, it dissipated. It was a form of natural selection, but operating on a completely different level. It wasn't the selection of organisms, but the selection of patterns. Patterns that reinforced themselves persisted. Patterns that didn't vanished. And over thousands, perhaps millions of years, the patterns that persisted became increasingly complex and increasingly effective at perpetuating themselves. Chapter 5. The Architecture of Sound. What was Ishkara physically? It was hard to say where it began and ended. It wasn't a creature in the traditional sense. It had no solid body. Instead, it was a specific organization of matter held in place by acoustic fields. Imagine a sculpture made of sand, but instead of gravity holding the grains in place, it's sound waves. Ishkara's structure extended for meters, perhaps tens of meters, a vast three-dimensional architecture of organized molecules suspended in water. But they weren't static molecules. They vibrated constantly, flowing in and out of the structure, continuously replaced but maintaining the overall pattern. At the heart of Ishkara was what we might call a resonant core, a region where multiple frequencies overlapped, creating incredibly complex interference patterns. Here, information was encoded not in DNA sequences, but in standing wave patterns, in frequencies and phases of vibrations that persisted through time. Around this core, layers of complexity extended. Organs, specialized regions where specific acoustic patterns performed particular functions. There were regions that captured energy from thermal currents, converting temperature differences into useful vibrations. There were regions that processed information, altering acoustic patterns in response to environmental changes. And there were the membranes, boundaries where Ishkara's pattern interfered with the surrounding ocean. These weren't biological membranes, but transitions, places where Ishkara's ordered pattern gradually dissolved into the ocean's acoustic chaos. By controlling these membranes, modulating how waves passed through them, Ishkara could interact with the outside world. Chapter 6. Vibrational Metabolism. Every living being needs energy. For creatures like us, energy comes from food. From organic molecules we break down to extract chemical energy. For plants, it comes from sunlight captured by photosynthesis. But Ishkara didn't eat and didn't photosynthesize. Where did its energy come from? Ishkara was a thermoacoustic being. Its energy came from temperature gradients in the ocean. Hydrothermal vents pumped hot water constantly, creating enormous temperature differences over short distances. These temperature differences weren't just differences in temperature. They were forms of free energy, energy that could be captured and used. Ishkara's structure included what we might call thermoacoustic engines, regions where temperature oscillations were converted into pressure oscillations, into sound. It was similar to the principle behind Stirling engines, but operating on a microscopic scale and using water as the working fluid. These generated vibrations powered the rest of Ishkara's structure. They maintained the acoustic patterns that organized its molecules. They powered the processes Ishkara used to think, to process information. And they provided the energy needed for Ishkara to grow, slowly expanding its patterns into larger volumes of ocean. But Ishkara didn't just consume energy. It also transformed it and released it back into the environment. The vibrations passing through its structure were altered, modulated, transformed into more ordered patterns. Ishkara was, in a sense, cleaning the ocean's acoustic chaos, extracting order from noise, and rejecting entropy back into the environment. Chapter 7. Vibrational Perception. How did Ishkara perceive the world? It had no eyes, no ears in the traditional sense, no nervous system. But it had something analogous: sensitivity to acoustic patterns. Every sound wave passing through Ishkara interacted with its structure. Waves of certain frequencies resonated with specific parts of Ishkara, amplified and reinforced. Other frequencies were attenuated or reflected. By feeling these resonances, Ishkara could detect events in the surrounding ocean. A volcanic eruption kilometers away produced a characteristic rumble, a specific acoustic signature. Ishkara could hear that rumble, not in the sense that we hear sounds, but by feeling the vibrations propagate through its structure and disturb its internal patterns. A change in ocean currents altered the ocean's background noise, the constant hum of moving water. Ishkara detected these changes, perceiving them as subtle alterations in the patterns that constituted it. Even chemical events had acoustic signatures. When a hydrothermal vent changed its chemical composition, the emerging water had slightly different density, altering how sound waves propagated through it. Ishkara could taste these chemical changes through their acoustic manifestations. This was a type of perception radically different from what we know. Ishkara didn't see the world as a visual image, but as a panorama of vibrations, a four-dimensional sonic landscape, 3 spatial dimensions plus time, where every object and event was defined by its acoustic properties. Chapter 8. Emergent Intelligence. Was Ishkara intelligent? The question is complicated. Ishkara certainly didn't have consciousness in the sense we understand. It had no subjective experiences, didn't wonder about its own existence, had no plans or desires. But Ishkara processed information, and it did so in surprisingly sophisticated ways. Ishkara's brain, if we can call it that, was a system of interfering acoustic waves. When 2 vibration patterns met in Ishkara's structure, they interfered, creating interference patterns. These patterns, in turn, affected how future waves would propagate through the structure. It was a form of analog computation, similar to how water waves in a bowl can solve certain types of mathematical equations through their interferences. Ishkara was constantly calculating, processing the acoustic patterns that constituted it, and arriving at conclusions that manifested as changes in its structure. These conclusions were, in essence, predictions. Ishkara learned, through countless cycles of trial and error over thousands of years, to anticipate patterns in the ocean's chaos. When certain acoustic patterns appeared, Ishkara knew, in a purely physical sense, without consciousness, that other patterns would likely follow. This knowledge allowed Ishkara to respond to the environment in ways that seemed almost purposeful. If acoustic patterns indicated an approaching disturbance, Ishkara could adjust its structure to become more resilient. If patterns indicated an abundance of thermal energy in a certain direction, Ishkara could grow in that direction, expanding its patterns to capture more energy. Chapter 9. The Reproduction of Patterns. All forms of life reproduce, passing information to the next generation. Ishkara was no exception. but its method of reproduction was as unique as the rest of its existence. Ishkara didn't divide like a cell, didn't lay eggs like an animal, didn't scatter seeds like a plant. Instead, Ishkara reproduced through the propagation of patterns, a process we might call sympathetic resonance or acoustic infection. When Ishkara grew sufficiently large and complex, its acoustic patterns became so intense that they began to affect regions of the ocean beyond its own structure. Waves emanating from Ishkara propagated through the ocean, carrying information encoded in patterns of frequency, phase, and amplitude. If these waves encountered a region of the ocean with the right conditions, a suitable acoustic chamber with appropriate geometry and adequate availability of thermal energy, they could seed a new resonant pattern. The molecules in that region would begin to organize in response to the incoming acoustic patterns from Ishkara, and gradually, a new structure similar to Ishkara would emerge. This process was slow, taking perhaps decades or even centuries, and it often failed. Most acoustic seeds that Ishkara scattered encountered unsuitable environments and quickly dissipated. But occasionally, a seed found perfect conditions, and a new Ishkara was born. These offspring weren't exact clones. The acoustic patterns that formed them were similar to the original Ishkaras, but modified by the journey through the ocean and the specific characteristics of their new location. It was a form of heredity with variation, the essential ingredients for evolution. Chapter 10. The silent ecosystem, Ishkara wasn't alone in the depths of the primordial ocean. While Ishkara was certainly the most exotic form of life, the ocean teemed with more conventional life forms, primitive bacteria and archaea living around hydrothermal vents, feeding on chemical energy. There was a curious interaction between Ishkara and these microscopic life forms. The vibrations Ishkara generated affected the microorganisms around it. Intense ultrasonic waves could rupture cell membranes, killing bacteria. But gentler vibrations could stimulate microbial metabolism, accelerating chemical reactions within cells. Ishkara, unconsciously, created microbial gardens around itself. The vibrations emanating from its structure shaped the nearby microbial communities, favoring certain species over others. Bacteria that could tolerate or even benefit from Ishkara's vibrations thrived. Those that couldn't were eliminated. In turn, these microbial communities affected Ishkara. They altered the local water chemistry, producing compounds that changed how sound waves propagated. Some bacteria produced gases that formed bubbles, creating reflective surfaces that altered acoustic patterns. Others produced polymers that changed the water's viscosity, affecting sound transmission. It was a primitive type of symbiosis, though unintentional on both sides. Ishkara and the microbial communities co-evolved, each shaping the other's environment, creating a unique ecosystem centered on vibrations and resonances. Chapter 11. The Great Climate Change. Then, about 3.7 billion years ago, Earth's climate began to change. The asteroid and comet bombardment, which had been intense during Earth's first billion years, was finally waning. With fewer impacts injecting heat into the atmosphere and ocean, the planet began to cool gradually. For most life forms of the time, this change was beneficial. Lower temperatures and more stable conditions allowed life to diversify and spread. But for Ishkara, the change was an existential crisis. Ishkara depended on strong temperature gradients. Its structure and metabolism were based on converting temperature differences into vibrations. As the ocean cooled and temperature gradients diminished, the energy available to Ishkara decreased proportionally. Ishkara's structures began to weaken. Patterns that had once been stable and robust became fragile and intermittent. Some Ishkara structures simply dissolved, their patterns no longer strong enough to hold against the ocean's chaos. But life is adaptable, and even a form as exotic as Ishkara was subject to evolution. Those Ishkara structures that survived the climate change were those that, by chance, had variations making them more efficient at capturing energy from weaker temperature gradients. Chapter 12. Extreme Adaptations. The evolutionary pressure of climate change forced Ishkara to evolve in remarkable directions. One crucial adaptation was the development of resonant amplifiers, specialized structures that could capture energy from very weak environmental vibrations and amplify them. Imagine a system of carefully arranged crystals and cavities, where incoming sound waves at a specific frequency are trapped and reverberated, increasing in intensity with each reflection until they reach useful amplitudes. Ishkara developed bioacoustic analogs of these systems, using organized molecules instead of solid crystals. Another adaptation was greater efficiency in converting thermal energy into acoustic energy. Older versions of Ishkara wasted most of the energy they captured. Evolved versions were far more efficient, extracting useful work from temperature differences that older versions wouldn't even notice. Ishkara also became smaller and more compact. Large structures were easy to maintain when energy was abundant, but became unsustainable in times of scarcity. Smaller Ishkaras had lower maintenance energy costs and could survive on fewer resources. These adaptations allowed Ishkara not only to survive the climate change, but to thrive in a new niche. The new Ishkaras were more numerous, smaller, and more diverse than their ancestors. They spread to more regions of the ocean, adapting to a wider variety of conditions. Chapter 13. Communication between patterns. As populations of Ishkara grew, something unexpected happened. They began to communicate. It wasn't communication in the sense we understand, with intention and meaning, but it was information transfer between separate structures. When two Ishkaras were close enough, their acoustic fields overlapped. One Ishkara's vibration patterns interfered with the others. If the frequencies were similar, the two Ishkaras could enter sympathetic resonance, synchronizing their vibrations. This synchronization had interesting effects. Two resonating Ishkaras could generate much stronger acoustic patterns than either alone. It was like two speakers playing the same sound, creating volume greater than the sum of their individual parts. But more than just amplification, resonance between Ishkaras allowed transfer of structural information. Patterns existing in one Ishkara could be copied to another through synchronization of their vibrations. It was a primitive form of social learning or cultural transmission, though without any consciousness or intention. Groups of synchronized Ishkaras could create acoustic patterns of complexity impossible for a single Ishkara. These colonies or choirs of Ishkaras operating in harmony became a new form of organization, a higher level of emergent complexity arising from the coordination of individual structures. Chapter 14. The Inner Silence. Paradoxically, as Ishkara became more sophisticated in manipulating vibrations, it developed the ability to create silence. Not complete absence of sound, but regions of relative calm within the ocean's acoustic chaos. Ishkara did this through active noise cancellation. By generating vibrations precisely out of phase with environmental noise, Ishkara could create bubbles of relative quietude within its structure. These silent zones were crucial for certain delicate processes that required stable acoustic conditions. Within these pockets of silence, Ishkara could store information more stably. Patterns that would be quickly corrupted by environmental noise could persist for long periods in calm conditions. It was a form of memory, allowing Ishkara to remember useful patterns and retrieve them when needed. The development of silence manipulation transformed Ishkara from a creature that passively reacted to environmental vibrations into one that actively shaped its acoustic environment. Ishkara could now create complex acoustic environments, with regions of silence interspersed with regions of intense vibration, each serving different functions. This ability to weave patterns of sound and silence was what led to the name Ishkara, meaning weaver of silence. She didn't just respond to vibrations, she orchestrated them, creating silent symphonies in the depths of the primordial ocean. Chapter 15. Encounters with other life forms. As life on primitive Earth diversified, Ishkara encountered increasingly complex life forms. Stromatolites, structures built by microbial communities in shallow waters, began to appear. More complex cells, the first eukaryotes, were emerging. Ishkara had limited interactions with these life forms. Most lived in environments very different from Ishkara's deep ocean habitat. But occasionally, microbial cells were carried to the depths by currents, and some found ways to survive there. Some of these cells learned to live in association with Ishkara. The vibrations Ishkara generated could be harmful, but they could also be beneficial. Certain bacteria developed mechanisms to harness Ishkara's vibrations, using them to power their own metabolic processes. These symbiotic bacteria began to colonize Ishkara's structures, forming biofilms on the membranes where Ishkara's patterns interfaced with the ocean. They didn't harm Ishkara, and in fact provided benefits. The biofilms altered how sound waves interacted with Ishkara's structure, in ways that sometimes increased Ishkara's efficiency. It was the beginning of a deeper symbiotic relationship. Over millions of years, Ishkara and its associated bacteria would co-evolve, each shaping the other's evolution, creating hybrid systems that combined elements of acoustic-based life with traditional chemical-based life. Chapter 16. The Golden Age. Between 3.7 and 3.5 billion years ago, Ishkara reached its peak. Populations of Ishkara inhabited vast expanses of the deep ocean, particularly around mid-ocean ridge systems where hydrothermal activity was intense. It was the golden age of acoustic life on Earth. Ishkaras of this era had evolved into countless varieties, each adapted to specific niches. There were small, efficient Ishkaras that lived in energy-limited environments. There were giant Ishkaras that dominated energy-rich regions, their structures extending for hundreds of meters. There were Ishkaras specialized in certain acoustic frequencies, forming a chromatic ecology based on sound rather than light. Choirs of synchronized Ishkaras created acoustic landscapes of extraordinary beauty, though no ear existed to appreciate them. Vibration patterns intertwined in complex harmonies, creating fractal resonant structures that extended for kilometers. Microbial life also thrived in association with Ishkara. Entire ecosystems had evolved around Ishkara structures, with different species of bacteria and archaea occupying different acoustic zones within and around the Ishkaras. It was a strange and wonderful world, unique in Earth's history. But like all golden ages, this one wouldn't last forever. Chapter 17. The Great Poisoning. The change came, as it often does, from an unexpected place, the ocean's surface. There, in sunlit shallow waters, cyanobacteria had evolved a revolutionary innovation: oxygenic photosynthesis. They could use sunlight to split water molecules, releasing oxygen as a byproduct. At first, this had little impact. The oxygen produced reacted quickly with dissolved iron in the ocean, forming iron oxides that precipitated and sank to the seafloor. But eventually, after millions of years of continuous photosynthesis, all available iron in the ocean was oxidized. Oxygen began to accumulate in the water. For most life forms of the time, oxygen was a deadly poison. It was a highly reactive gas that damaged delicate organic molecules, especially those involved in metabolism. Life forms that had evolved in an oxygen-free world weren't prepared to deal with it. Ishkara was particularly vulnerable. Its structure depended on organic molecules precisely organized by acoustic fields. These molecules were sensitive to oxidation. When oxygen dissolved in the deep waters, it reacted with Ishkara's components, corrupting the carefully maintained molecular patterns. Moreover, oxygen changed the water's physical properties in subtle but significant ways. It altered density, compressibility, and acoustic attenuation. These changes disrupted the acoustic patterns sustaining Ishkara, like detuning a musical instrument. Chapter 18. The Great Extinction. The ocean's oxygenation was gradual, taking millions of years to complete, but it was inexorable. Ishkaras in shallower waters were affected first, their structures corrupted by descending oxygen. They tried to migrate to deeper waters, but oxygen followed, slowly but steadily. Ishkara populations collapsed dramatically. Structures that had persisted for thousands of years dissolved in decades as oxygen infiltrated their environments. Entire choirs of synchronized Ishkaras fell silent, their patterns fragmented by the chemical chaos of oxidation. Some Ishkaras tried to adapt. Variants that, by chance, had components more resistant to oxidation survived a little longer. But the change was too fast and too fundamental. There wasn't enough evolutionary time for Ishkara to develop effective defenses against oxygen's poison. The symbiotic microbial communities around Ishkara suffered too. Many anaerobic bacterial species went extinct from oxygenation. Some evolved to tolerate or even use oxygen, transforming into the first aerobic bacteria. But this transformation broke the delicate symbiotic relationships that had developed over millions of years. In just a few million years, what had been a thriving acoustic biosphere reduced to scattered fragments. The vast majority of Ishkaras went extinct. The Golden Age had ended, giving way to an era of decline and eventual disappearance. Chapter 19. Refugees in the Depths. But life is tenacious, and even in the face of the great oxygen poisoning catastrophe, some pockets of Ishkara survived. In the ocean's deepest regions, in isolated basins where circulation was limited, oxygen took longer to penetrate. These depths became refuges, oases of anoxic conditions in an increasingly oxygenated ocean. The Ishkaras that managed to reach these refuges found environments where they could, at least temporarily, continue existing as before. But they were tiny refuges. The surviving Ishkaras were confined to minuscule volumes of ocean compared to the vast domains their species once inhabited. And even in these refuges, the threat of oxygen loomed constantly, occasional currents bringing oxygenated water down and causing episodes of mortality. In the extreme conditions of these refugees, Ishkara continued to evolve, but in increasingly specialized and limited directions. Some lineages became incredibly tolerant of hypoxic conditions, able to survive even when traces of oxygen infiltrated their environments. Others developed acoustic hibernation capabilities, completely silencing their patterns during periods of stress and reactivating when conditions improved. But these were desperate measures, last-ditch survival strategies of a life form facing inevitable extinction. The overall trend was clear. Ishkara was fading from Earth. Chapter 20. The Last Songs. By around 3.2 billion years ago, the last major populations of Ishkara were confined to a few isolated deep basins, mainly around hydrothermal vents and subduction zones where the ocean floor was being pulled downward, carrying anoxic water with it. These final Ishkaras were shadows of their glorious ancestors, smaller, simpler, operating with marginal efficiency in increasingly hostile environments. But they continued to exist, keeping the lineage of acoustic life alive against all odds. Some modern scientists speculate that perhaps, just perhaps, extremely reduced forms of Ishkara may still exist today, hidden in extreme anoxic environments we haven't fully explored. It would be extraordinary if true, an unbroken lineage of acoustic life stretching back over 3 billion years. But even if the last Ishkaras finally went extinct, as seems likely, they didn't disappear completely without leaving traces. Their legacy persists in subtle but significant ways. Chapter 21. The Molecular Legacy. When Ishkaras died, their carefully organized molecular structures broke down, releasing their components back into the ocean. But some of these molecules were unusual, with specific structures or chiralities reflecting their origin in acoustically directed processes. These peculiar molecules entered the marine environment, where they could be incorporated by other life forms. Bacteria and archaea absorbed and sometimes incorporated these compounds into their own metabolisms. Over millions of years, traces of Ishkara's biochemistry were absorbed into conventional life. Some scientists suggest that certain peculiarities of modern terrestrial biochemistry may be remnants of this legacy. For example, why does terrestrial life use only right-handed forms of certain sugars and left-handed forms of amino acids, when both forms are chemically equivalent? Could this asymmetry have been influenced by molecules inherited from Ishkara? Similarly, certain organic compounds found in very ancient sedimentary rocks have structures that are difficult to explain through known biochemical processes. Some of these compounds have unusual isotopic patterns, suggesting they were formed through unconventional processes. Could they be molecular fossils of Ishkara? Chapter 22. Echoes in Rock. If Ishkara existed, what kind of fossil record would it leave? Traditional fossils are preservations of solid structures, shells, bones, impressions of soft tissues. But Ishkara had no permanent solid structures. It was patterns in water, temporary organizations of molecules held in place by vibrations. But even ephemeral structures can leave traces. When Ishkaras operated near the ocean floor, their intense vibrations could affect sediments. Standing wave patterns could organize sediment particles into regular arrangements, similar to Chladni patterns where sand on a vibrating plate forms geometric designs. If these organized sediments were quickly buried and lithified, turning into rock, they could preserve strange geometric patterns, structures that don't resemble anything formed by normal geological processes or conventional life. Geologists occasionally find ancient rocks with sedimentary structures that defy easy explanation. Concentric patterns, hexagonal arrangements, regular laminations that don't match any known process. Most probably have conventional geological explanations not yet understood. But some could be evidence of Ishkara, acoustic fossils of a forgotten life form. Chapter 23. Implications for exotic life. The story of Ishkara, though speculative, has important implications for how we think about life in general and the search for life on other worlds. It illustrates that life can take radically different forms from what we're accustomed to. When searching for life on other planets, we tend to look for signs of life as we know it. Liquid water, organic carbon, metabolism based on redox reactions. But what if life can be based on completely different principles? What if acoustic, plasmic, crystalline, or other exotic varieties of life are possible? Ishkara suggests that life doesn't necessarily require permanent solid structures. It can be based on self-sustaining patterns in fluid media, dynamic organizations that persist through constant flow of matter and energy. Such life could exist in gas giant atmospheres, in liquid ammonia oceans on icy moons, or in methane lakes on Titan. More fundamentally, Ishkara challenges our definition of life. What defines something as alive? Metabolism, reproduction, evolution. Ishkara had all these characteristics, but in such different ways that we might not recognize it as life if we encountered it. How many exotic life forms have we failed to recognize because they don't look like what we expect? Chapter 24. Recreating Ishkara. In the modern era, with our advanced technology, could we recreate something similar to Ishkara in a lab? In principle, yes. The physical phenomena that would sustain Ishkara are well understood: acoustics, thermodynamics, self-organization in non-equilibrium systems. Scientists have already created experimental systems where sound waves organize particles into complex patterns. Acoustic levitation can suspend objects in mid-air using sound alone. Acoustic tweezers can manipulate cells and microparticles with precision. Thermoacoustic engines can convert temperature differences into sound and vice versa. But creating a truly self-replicating and evolutionary system like Ishkara would be immensely more difficult. It would require not just reproducing individual physical phenomena, but integrating them into a coherent system capable of emergent complex behavior. Some research in artificial life and self-organizing chemistry is moving in that direction. Scientists are creating proto-life forms based on unconventional principles, exploring the boundary between inanimate matter and life. Perhaps one day we can create modern analogs of Ishkara, not as historical recreations, but as new forms of artificial life. Chapter 25. Ishkara and Consciousness. A fascinating philosophical question. Did Ishkara have subjective experience? Was there something it was like to be Ishkara? The question is profound and may be impossible to answer definitively. Ishkara processed information, responded to the environment, had something analogous to perception and even learning. But these processes were based on pure physics, without neurons, without synapses, without anything resembling a brain. Could such a system have consciousness? Some philosophers would argue that consciousness requires specific substrates, like biological neurons or perhaps sufficiently complex digital computers. Under that view, Ishkara, no matter how complex, would be an unconscious automaton, processing information but without subjective experience. Others would argue that consciousness is a property of sufficiently complex information processing systems, independent of the specific substrate. If Ishkara processed information in sufficiently sophisticated ways, it might have had some form of subjective experience, as alien to us as our consciousness would be to it. Well, perhaps never know the answer, but contemplating the question helps us better understand the mysteries of consciousness, and challenges us to consider whether other forms of mind radically different from ours might exist in the universe. Chapter 26. Language of vibrations. If Ishkara had something like consciousness or intelligence, would it have something like language? Could Ishkaras communicate with each other in meaningful ways? As we discussed earlier, Ishkaras could synchronize their vibrations when close, creating coordinated acoustic patterns. Could this serve as a primitive form of communication? If one Ishkara developed a useful vibrational pattern, like a new way to capture energy or resist disturbances, could it teach that pattern to other Ishkaras through sympathetic resonance? Such a system wouldn't be language in the human sense. There would be no syntax, grammar, or explicit semantics, but it would be information transfer between individuals, and information that could modify behavior. In a sense, it would be similar to how bees communicate through dances, or how plants communicate through chemical signals. If choirs of synchronized Ishkaras could create more complex acoustic patterns than isolated individuals, this could have led to rudimentary forms of culture or traditions in acoustics. Particular patterns might be maintained in certain groups of Ishkaras and transmitted to new generations, creating regional dialects of vibration. It's fascinating to imagine, in the depths of the primordial ocean, before any animal existed, before brains or nervous systems evolved, could there have been primitive forms of culture and communication operating through patterns of sound and silence? Chapter 27. The Ishkara Principle. Beyond its possible historical existence, Ishkara represents an important principle in astrobiology and origin of life studies. The Ishkara principle, which we might state as, life can emerge from any physical system capable of storing information, metabolizing energy, and reproducing with hereditary variation, independent of the specific substrate. This principle encourages us to broaden our search for life beyond conventional paradigms. Instead of looking only for DNA-based, water and carbon life, we should consider broader possibilities. Silicon-based life instead of carbon, life using liquid ammonia instead of water, life operating at cryogenic temperatures or in high radiation environments, and, more radically, life based on completely different organizational principles. Life as self-replicating patterns in plasmas, life as crystalline structures capable of storing and processing information, life as standing waves in planetary atmospheres. The Ishkara principle suggests that the universe may be far more full of life than we think, but that much of that life may be so different from ours that we wouldn't easily recognize it. Searching for such exotic life requires not just new instruments, but new conceptual paradigms. Chapter 28. Lessons for Humanity. The saga of Ishkara, from its emergence in the primordial depths to its eventual extinction, offers lessons that transcend science and touch existential questions about the nature of life and our own place in the cosmos. First, Ishkara teaches us humility. Our form of life, based on DNA and proteins, isn't the only possible one. We're not the inevitable pinnacle of evolution, but just one among potentially countless variations on the theme of life. In the vast universe, forms of life we would consider impossible or bizarre may be common. Second, Ishkara illustrates impermanence. Even a successful life form, dominating its environment for millions of years, can be driven to extinction by environmental changes. No species is permanent, no civilization eternal. Adaptability and the ability to respond to change are more important than dominance in stable conditions. Third, Ishkara demonstrates the value of diversity. Earth's biosphere is incredibly diverse, with millions of species occupying countless niches. This diversity isn't just aesthetically valuable, it's essential for resilience. When catastrophes wipe out dominant life forms, it's the remaining diversity that allows life to recover and evolve in new directions. Chapter 29. Ishkara in Culture and Imagination. Although Ishkara is a speculative scientific construct, the concept has potential to inspire art, literature, and philosophy. The image of a life form, made of sound and silence, weaving patterns in the dark depths of an ancient ocean, is poetically powerful. Science fiction writers could explore scenarios where acoustic life exists on other worlds, perhaps in dense atmospheres of gas giants, where sound wave patterns could organize matter. Artists could create portraits of Ishkara, visualizations of how these acoustic beings might look if we could somehow see vibration patterns. Philosophers could use Ishkara as a thought experiment to explore questions about consciousness, identity, and the nature of life. If Ishkara existed and had some form of subjective experience, what would it be like? What kind of qualia, what kind of sensory experiences would a creature made of vibrations have? Musicians and composers could draw inspiration from Ishkara to create works exploring the boundaries between sound and silence, order and chaos, pattern and noise. The idea of life as music, of existence as resonance, has profound metaphorical resonance. Chapter 30. The Future of Bioacoustics. Regardless of whether Ishkara existed historically, the study of bioacoustic phenomena and the possibility of exotic life forms based on acoustic principles is a legitimate field of scientific research. We already know that sound plays important roles in terrestrial biology. Whales and dolphins use sophisticated echolocation to navigate and hunt. Some fish species produce and detect electric fields, which are closely related to vibrations. Plants respond to sound vibrations in complex ways we're only beginning to understand. Future research could explore how acoustic phenomena could be harnessed to create new types of technology, or even synthetic life forms. Imagine nanomachines controlled by ultrasonic waves, or computing systems based on acoustic interference patterns instead of electronic circuits. In space environments, where gravitational, magnetic, and electric fields can create complex patterns, exotic organizations similar to Ishkara might be possible. Future missions to oceanic worlds like Europa could include specialized acoustic sensors to search not just for conventional life, but for anomalous acoustic patterns that might indicate exotic life forms. Chapter 31. Reconsidering the Origin of Life. The possibility of Ishkara also makes us reconsider theories about the origin of life on Earth. Most theories focus on how simple organic molecules could have organized into primitive cells. But what if there were multiple origins of life on primitive Earth, including exotic forms like Ishkara that later went extinct? This could explain certain anomalies in the fossil and geological record. For example, there is evidence of biological activity in rocks over 3.8 billion years old, but these evidences are controversial and hard to interpret. Could some be traces of exotic life forms that didn't survive to the present? It also raises the possibility that life as we know it wasn't the first form of life on Earth, but merely the one that survived and thrived. Perhaps there was a prior biosphere, radically different, that was replaced by DNA-based life when conditions changed. In that sense, we would be a second Genesis, not the first. This perspective is also relevant for searching for life on Mars or other worlds. If we find evidence of ancient but extinct life on Mars, we should be open to the possibility that this life may have been fundamentally different from terrestrial life, perhaps more similar to exotic forms like Ishkara than to conventional life. Chapter 32. The Final Silence. The story of Ishkara ends like so many tales of extinct species, in silence. The last Ishkaras, confined to ever smaller refuges, eventually disappeared when even these final strongholds were penetrated by oxygenated water. The acoustic patterns that defined them dissipated, their vibrations merging into the ocean's background noise. But perhaps silence isn't the right word. Ishkara, the weaver of silence, understood that silence isn't absence of sound, but a special kind of sound. Silence is pattern, is structure, is information. Even in its extinction, Ishkara left patterns, traces that persist in the molecules that make up modern life, in structures preserved in ancient rocks, in the possibilities it represents for exotic life on other worlds. Ishkara's final silence isn't empty. It's full of meaning, of lessons, of inspiration. It reminds us that life is more diverse and stranger than we imagine, that forms of existence radically different from ours are possible, that the universe is full of wonders we have barely begun to comprehend. Epilogue. Songs of the future. Thousands of years in the future, perhaps humanity will have spread to the stars, exploring countless worlds around distant suns. And in some alien ocean, beneath layers of ice on a distant moon, our descendants may find something that reminds them of Ishkara. Perhaps it's a real acoustic life form, evolved independently under conditions similar to those of primitive Earth. Perhaps it's just an interesting physical system, self-organized patterns that approach but don't quite reach true life. Or perhaps it's something completely different, a form of existence so strange that Ishkara would seem conventional by comparison. Whatever the case, Ishkara's lesson will endure. Keep an open mind, search in unexpected places, and never assume you fully understand the limits of the possible. The universe is vast, ancient, and creative beyond any imagination. Life, in all its possible and impossible forms, is out there, waiting to be discovered. And when we finally find it, when we make contact with truly alien forms of existence, perhaps we'll hear echoes of Ishkara in the songs these beings sing. Not songs of voice or instruments, but songs of vibration and resonance, patterns woven from sound and silence, the universal language of the cosmos. Ishkara may have lived 3.8 billion years ago, or may never have existed, but the principle it represents, the possibility it embodies, is eternal. Wherever there is energy flowing, information being processed, patterns organizing against entropy, there is the potential for life. And where there is life, there is always the possibility of something wonderful, something unexpected, something that teaches us the universe is stranger and more beautiful than we dream. Conclusion. The saga of Ishkara, the weaver of silence, is a journey through deep time and exotic possibilities. Although Ishkara is speculative, based on real physical phenomena and plausible principles of self-organization, it serves as a powerful reminder that life can take forms that challenge our imagination. From the acoustic chambers of the primordial ocean to the final silence of extinction, Ishkara's story illustrates universal themes: emergence, adaptation, diversity, and impermanence. It's a parable about the boundaries of life and an invitation to expand our search for life in the universe beyond conventional paradigms. More fundamentally, Ishkara challenges us to reconsider what it means to be alive. If life can be made of vibration patterns instead of cells and tissues, of resonances instead of chemical metabolism, then perhaps the universe is more full of life than we ever imagined. And perhaps in the depths of the primordial ocean, or the vastnesses of alien worlds, life forms we never dreamed of are weaving their own silent symphonies, waiting to be discovered.